Hey there, welcome to the Self-Worth Renaissance podcast. I am your host, Kirsten Van Wingerden, and I am so honored that you're here. I'm a licensed mental health counselor in Washington State. Please note that what is about to be discussed in this episode is not a replacement for individual therapy and is a collection of musings and thoughts on mental health topics. Welcome back to the Self-Worth Renaissance, the podcast where we rediscover our worth, embrace our imperfections, and step into the most empowered version of ourselves. I'm Kirsten Van Wingerden, your host and licensed mental health counselor, here to guide you through your journey towards self-love and confidence. Today's episode is all about boundaries, what they are, why they're essential, and how they reflect our self-worth in action. And I get it. Setting boundaries can feel really uncomfortable and even guilt-inducing. But the truth is, boundaries aren't selfish. They're a way to protect your energy, honor your values, and show yourself the respect that you deserve. So let's talk about why boundaries matter and how you can start setting them with confidence. So first, let's define what boundaries actually are. Boundaries are the limits we set to protect our physical, emotional, and mental well-being. They define what is and isn't okay for us in our relationships, our work, and our daily lives. I think it can get really confusing with boundaries sometimes because we might think that when we set a boundary that we are controlling another person's behaviors. But really, we are in a sense really controlling only our own behaviors. We have no control over if someone respects a boundary that is set, but we have all the control over how we respond to someone else's behavior towards us. For example, I always tell clients that boundaries are set as an opportunity to build relationships and to allow relationships to flourish in a way that is sustainable and maintainable. For example, let's say your mom, and this is an extreme example, but maybe this is your life. I'm not going to judge, okay? But let's say your mom likes to call you at every single night at 9 p.m. and talk about her day. And she keeps you on the phone for like an entire hour. And you're like, oh my gosh, I need to get up at 5:30 a.m. for work or to go to the gym or whatever it is that you need to do to take care of your mental health. And a healthy boundary that you could set is to communicate first, which, by the way, all good boundaries should be communicated unless you are dealing with a narcissist, and then that's a whole other topic. You can look at Dr. Rami Durvasala's work. I might be mispronouncing her name, but she's great, and we can talk about that more at a different time. But okay, let's say mom is a healthy human being, right? And the first thing you want to do is to communicate clearly. So you could say, hey mom, I love talking to you, I value you, and I know you find meaning in our conversations, as do I. Could we move this phone call sooner in the day or a little less frequently? I'm finding that the lack of sleep is really impacting me and how I'm showing up at work, etc. You fill in the blank. And you might find that I'm putting my phone on Do Not Disturb at 8:30 every night, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Right? So that's like the blueprint for setting a boundary. Hey, this is what I need. This is the action I'm taking moving forward and how to handle this, right? It doesn't make that person change what they're doing, but we change our behavior in response to that. And a boundary is really that's such an example of not controlling someone else's behavior, but changing our own behaviors. And what's really scary about boundaries is that you could lose relationships. But what you have to consider is, are those relationships what you want to maintain and flourish in your life if you can't be your full self in those relationships? And without boundaries, we risk overextending ourselves, feeling resentful, and ultimately burning out. Not having boundaries shows other people that they can walk all over you. And we don't want that for ourselves or for the people in our lives that we care about. I think about like, okay, would I want this to happen to a friend or my child or my sister, right? Probably not. And so think about what is going on and what it might look like to respect yourself and what you have to offer in this world and this life. Because if you are going to constantly give your energy to things in your life that don't align with your values, you're going to live a life that just does not feel fulfilling. And I know that's a really hard truth to sit with and to consider and to feel, but just consider that, right? Like boundaries allow a life that feels fulfilling. And here's the game changer. Boundaries are a direct reflection of your self-worth. When you respect your own needs and limits, you send a powerful message to yourself and to other people that you are valuable. But when you consistently ignore your boundaries, you might be telling yourself and others that your needs don't matter. And let me tell you something. Your needs absolutely matter. And if that's the only thing that you get out of this whole podcast, great. That is a win, right? Just remind yourself, your needs absolutely matter. And setting boundaries is not just an act of self-protection, it's an act of self-love. It's saying, I deserve to feel safe, respected, and valued. And I'd like to lead you in a little exercise. Okay? So I'd like you to imagine a situation coming up in your life where you feel anxious and unsure what your role is and how you want to participate in this event or the situation coming up. And maybe it's a hard conversation, maybe it's a work problem, maybe it's a relational problem. And I'd like for you to picture what it would look like to enter into that situation and to act as if you're a person who is confident, knows what you deserve, and knows your boundaries. So go ahead and just allow yourself to picture that. Now I'd like you to notice what that feels like in your body. Do you feel calmer than earlier? Do you feel excited about the idea of showing up authentically for what you need? And maybe you notice that some of that tension is starting to release a little bit. And last, I'd like you to picture the day after that interaction where you knew your role and your boundaries. How are you feeling? Are you feeling confident? Are you feeling secure in yourself? Did that become a catalyst for changing other actions and choices in your life? And I'd like you to just sit with that and to notice that. So the next time you wonder, will boundaries actually help my self-worth? Practice this exercise. It might surprise you what you find. Okay, so there are some common challenges in setting boundaries, and we know that setting boundaries is really tough, it's really hard, and the question is like, why is it so hard to set boundaries? So I want to share with you some of the common challenges that I see not only within my own life, but within the clients that I work with, the common themes that seem to come up. The first challenge in setting these boundaries is the fear of rejection or conflict. So you might worry that setting a boundary will upset someone or make them leave. And that might trigger some like childhood abandonment wounds, might activate some fears around, am I good enough? It just brings up a whole onslaught of insecurity. And if you grew up in a household where you couldn't have boundaries as a kid, and maybe you grew up with that sentiment of you are to be seen and not heard, this might be a really big challenge for you. And perhaps in your family of origin, conflict escalated really quickly, and there's a fear that in conflict, you would get demolished emotionally, hopefully not physically, but maybe that is part of your story. And that can get really in the way because your nervous system is mapped to that environment at such a young age that setting boundaries is just going to lead to a lack of safety. And it's important to remember that not all people function in this way, and you might actually be surprised how people can care for you outside of those environments that you grew up with. There might actually be safety in your environment that maybe you're not allowing yourself to open up to. And I do want to say, like, please work with a licensed professional if you're not sure if there is safety to set those boundaries. Really work with people you know or a trusted friend to discuss that, because sometimes too, when we've been in environments where it hasn't been safe, it can be really hard to decipher and determine what safety actually looks like and feels like in certain settings. So I want to just remind you of that too, to keep that in mind. The second barrier that can come up to boundaries is the feeling of guilt. So you feel like you're being selfish or unkind by saying no. You might feel like you owe things to other people that you don't owe anything to. And I think it's important to remember that, like, okay, we're so focused on being kind and we might feel guilty if we're not kind, but kindness is not the same as being a pushover. And I know that's hard to hear, but I think kindness can actually be the opposite of vulnerability if it's for the sake of being kind and protecting yourself. And that vulnerability being hidden by kindness is really just a protective mechanism, which could be an episode in itself, and maybe it will be. But I think we often get really confused about what kindness really is. And so we can talk about that in another episode. I think that really needs to be fleshed out more in its own accord. But when we start thinking about guilt, like, am I feeling guilty because I feel like I owe something to someone? And if I do, I should really start analyzing that and looking at that. And then the third one is people-pleasing tendencies. So especially for women and some men and, those non-binary folks, whoever you might be, I guess, you've been conditioned to prioritize others over yourself. And it's the age-old, tale of if everyone else in the room is happy, then I can be happy. And at times, yes, we do need to prioritize others, but overall, self-abandonment regularly leads to resentment and communicates to our internal self that we are not worthy. What is beautiful, though, is that even though we have these barriers of fear of rejection or conflict, guilt, or people-pleasing tendencies, and they might be barriers to setting boundaries, it's never too late to work through them. And part of owning our self-worth is learning how to do the work, even when we're scared to. So, how do we start setting boundaries? Let's get practical here. So, here are 5 steps to help you set boundaries that stick. The first one is to identify where boundaries are needed. Pay attention to where you feel drained, resentful, or uncomfortable. These are often signs that a boundary is missing. And that requires you to slow down, tune in, and listen to yourself. Number 2, get clear on your values. Boundaries are easier to set when you know what's most important to you. So, what are your non-negotiables? Write them down. Seriously though, like write down your non-negotiables. Like, is a non-negotiable that I get coffee every Friday morning and I go on a walk? Is it a non-negotiable that after 8 p.m. I stop looking at my phone and I don't answer messages? Is it a non-negotiable that I will always see at least one friend a week and I won't say yes to work and have that get in the way, right? Like, what are the values? What are the things that you want to see really grow in your life? And the third thing is to start small. So practice setting boundaries in low stakes situations. So for example, declining an invitation is something you're just not excited about, or turning to the barista and saying your order is wrong with care. Like, don't be a jerk, but like, hey, I think this might not be my drink, right? Like, you can do that. Or telling a friend that you'd love to talk to them, but it would be better to connect the next day, right? Start really small with those boundaries and you might surprise yourself what you're able to accomplish. And then communicate clearly and calmly, right? So use I statements to express your needs without blame. For example, I need some quiet time to recharge after work. I'm going to go into the office, or I'm going to go take a walk, or I'm going to listen to my favorite podcast, right? Like, clearly communicate your need and then take action on that need. Like, show that other person that, oh, and I'm following through with what I said. That can really just be such a game changer with people. And number 5, stand firm. You might experience some pushback, especially if people around you are used to you saying yes all the time. So stay grounded in your reasons for setting the boundary. Write them down, sticky note them in their car, or in your car, on your door, in your fridge. I literally don't care. Just set the boundary and stick to it. And it's okay to have little reminders around your house if you need them. And I want you to remember too, it's not your job to manage other people's reactions to your boundaries. Just a friendly reminder. So here's how I would start setting boundaries. Number 1, identify where boundaries are needed. Number 2, get clear on your values. 3, start small. 4, communicate clearly and calmly. And 5, stand firm in those boundaries. I do want to talk a little bit more about guilt, though, and freedom when it comes to setting boundaries. So when you set a boundary, you might feel like you're letting someone down, but I want to give you a reframe. By setting boundaries, you're actually showing up more authentically in your relationships. If someone truly values you, they'll respect your limits. And if they don't, well, that's something to reflect on. Pushback can be really natural, especially if you're changing old patterns. And the key is to remind yourself that you're not being mean, you're being honest. And honesty is the foundation of healthy relationships. And I think that sometimes we do need tact with our honesty, right? Like, we shouldn't say to someone, oh my gosh, I just think you're an insufferable person because X, Y, and Z. Like, that is not loving or caring in the slightest. But we might say instead, gosh, I don't even know what the opposite of telling someone they're insufferable would be now I'm thinking about it. But we would say something kind, right? Like, hey, I care about you. When you do X, Y, and Z, I notice that I start to pull away from you. That could be a healthier way to set a boundary with someone that maybe you don't share similar values with. And I also want to remind you too that boundaries are freedom creators. And when you set boundaries, you free yourself from resentment, overwhelm, and the pressure to be everything to everyone. You create space for what truly matters to you. So maybe you get to work on that project you've always wanted to complete, participate in that race, have a day of silence and inner reflection, or maybe finally get back to school. Boundaries can feel like the opposite of freedom because you have to practice discipline within yourself, but in creating discipline in your own life around your actions and how you show up in your relationships with others, you are creating the framework for a life that feels free. And I like to say that your ability to set boundaries, and it can be a framework for how you want to show up in the world and in direct correlation with your self-worth, right? So your boundaries show your worth. And oftentimes the greater our self-worth is and the more concrete it is, the more free we feel. So we feel free to make decisions that honor us and the time we have on this earth. And that's just not selfish. That's self-worth in action. So remember, setting boundaries is a journey. It's not a one-time event. It takes practice, patience, and self-compassion. But every time you set a boundary, you're taking a step towards a life that honors your worth. I want to leave you with this reminder. Boundaries aren't walls, they're bridges. They help you to connect with others in a way that feels safe, respectful, and authentic. If this episode resonated with you, I'd love to hear about it. You can DM me on Instagram at self_worth_renaissance or share your takeaway and hashtag selfworthrenaissance. And please don't forget to subscribe and download so you never miss an episode. It's just such an honor to get to hold this space with you and to talk to you all about boundaries today. So until then, keep honoring your worth and protecting your peace. You've got this.